by you taking us back to the day you got the call to say you are going to take charge of Madiba as one of his bodyguards.
Firstly, thanks for having me here. It took me a very long time to actually figure it out in my own head, to say what could have happened, why me? Because firstly, I was not trained for this kind of work. I was just a young person. I was part of the youth movement in this country. And then, of course, I was part of the political underground of the ANC. But it so happened that about 6 weeks before Tatu Mandela was released, I was part of a delegation of young people that had to meet him at the then Victor Verster Prison for a briefing, preparing for his release, what must be done, and all those issues. A strange thing happened there because we were a large group, about 40, were split into 2 groups, so I was part of the second group. It turned out that the first group that went to see him, you know, people were dressed formally in ties, and then of course we were going to meet this great statesman that we've never seen. If you remember at the time, the only picture we had was an artistic impression that appeared in the then New Nation. So we went there, the first group that was dressed formally, the feedback we got was that the man was wearing his tracksuits. And then of course expressed his disappointment that he thought, why young people will come in jeans, here we are in ties. So when we had to go as the second group, we thought because he was in a relaxed mood that we better wear tracksuits ourselves. Unbeknown to us that this time around, he was wearing a suit. So that's where it started, that you chaps, I can't trust you. I can't predict you. And of course, we did what had to be done there. We briefed us about the political situation and whatever else that we spoke about. On coming back, of course, there was the National Reception Committee, if you recall, headed by Cyril Ramaphosa. We had our tentative plans. The difficulty was that at the time, if you remember well, the Rivonia trialists were out. Our hands were full already. We had Ahmed Katrada, Andrew Mlangeni, Wilton Mkwai, Walter Sisulu. Our hands were full. And because we're non-statutory force, you could imagine what type of bodyguards are these? A, carrying unlicensed firearms. We did not have all the necessary infrastructure to be able to do what had to be done. But to cut the long story short, I was told that when Nelson Mandela comes out, the Cape Town comrades will be responsible for him from the gate up to the city center. Thereafter, we are on our own. That was the beginning of the nightmare. So I got a call through Ambassador Rapo Mulekane, who was in charge of all of us and all the logistics, that my man, you are in charge. And since then, I never looked back.
Talk us through that very first day. Now, there you are, having to take care, you are like outside the library in Cape Town, and you now have to take care of this man. What's going through your mind?
It was almost an impossible mission, because there were 2 problems that we had. Firstly, we knew that we did not have adequate infrastructure. You'd recall that at the time, whatever that was there, you had Operation Vula, people like Comrade Mek Maharaj, Spiwe Nyanda were in the country, Janet Love, Dipuwe Mvelase. There were quite a number of people, but these people were underground. They could not be seen above board. The other option was to rely on the infrastructure of the apartheid regime, which you couldn't.
Because they could not be trusted.
They couldn't be trusted. And besides, how do you say this person is free when you still have the same police force looking after him? But that be as it may, comrades were able to put ideas together, and thanks to Almighty God, we pulled through the first night, which was quite useful because there were a lot of people, there was excitement, so there was never a moment really where you were exposed and you were alone and you had to prove what you were capable of. So the first 2 days were not that bad because around the clock there were people. I think the main challenge started when we got into Johannesburg and we had to move into Vilakazi Street.
Now, before we get to Vilakazi Street, let's just stay with Cape Town for very briefly. Now, for those 2 days, where did you sleep?
There was no sleeping. We'd take turns to sleep in the car, because round the clock, as you remember, the first 48 hours, there was no sleeping, even for him. At the very most, in any case, his normal sleeping hours were about 4 hours. So it was work right through the clock.
Now, how many of you were there?
There were a lot of people.
No, at any one time, on average?
At any one time, there would be at least 6 people.
Now, what were you looking for? What is your brief? What are you there to look out for?
You'd have people who are responsible for his itinerary. Comrade Cyril was key, Zwelakhe Sisulu was key, Mefi Morobe was key. These are the people who would work sort of his itinerary. And you would have to know well in advance what is going to happen. So the first thing is, before he moves to the next point, you should be in the know of how is point B looking like, what changes needed to be made, how much time is it going to be spent, what sort of transport was going to be used. The irony of it all is that we hardly had cars. We're using hired cars from Avis. So everything, all odds were stacked against us. And even to this very day, it scares me. Sometimes I wake up, with a cold sweat to think, what if the worst was to happen?
But then where did you get your brief? Because there you were, untrained in that particular field of work. So where did you get your basics from?
Well, as underground operatives, there are basics that we would know, quite frankly. Basic military combat work. We're very good on conspiracy, on communication. We could do basic reconnaissance. So if the question is, were we really trained to be able to have the necessary technology, which would have included intelligence, to know what the threat was like and what to do? You did not have that. You relied on what you had. And what we had were basically underground structures of the ANC who would share information with us to say, expect this in this area. But the difficulty was that even with the basics that we had, the person we're supposed to be looking after had no inkling about any security detail. To him, was a free man. He wanted to meet his people.
How did he typically behave, especially that, take us through that first day?
That's the first difficulty, was that you could not tell Tata what to do. The brief was that you must do his work, he'll do his work. He never even questioned us to say, okay, guys, you are here in my space, who sent you? The assumption is that it was briefed that you'll cooperate, there are people, and he used to refer to us as his bosses. When people say, can I meet you? He says, well, talk to my bosses. And of course, to us, we knew that we'd have to talk to either Zwelakhe or Cyril, who would either say yes or no.
So he actually obliged?
Yeah, but the biggest threat was not from outside. He was the main threat, to put it bluntly.
How so?
We would be driving from point A to B, and there would be time limits set. But in the middle of nowhere, there would be an old lady, maybe with a baby at the back, with firewood on top of the head. He'll say, stop. In the middle of the road.
This is now much later.
Yeah.
In other words, we've gone beyond the first 48 hours.
Yeah, that's much late. The biggest threat was him. It was not really from outside, because he could not stick to any plan. To him, whatever moves him, if something touches him, gets off the script.
Not even a word to say,
no.
Hang on, guys, please,
no.
Can we?
No.
He just does it.
Just does it. He just does it. And then, of course, he hated the idea that each time people approach him, particularly, elderly women or young kids, and you'd want to stand between him and the people he wants to touch. We knew it was a big no. And yet, if anything was to go wrong, because at the time, remember, everybody wanted to have a piece of him, just to touch him. But the threat was that because people were pushing, and at his age, all that it took was for him to fall, and there's a stampede, and what would happen?
Did you at any point or points raise this with him, saying that as much as we are happy for you to do what you're doing, but it's dangerous?
Yes, but he throws it back to you to say, what do you suggest I do? Says, after 27 years in prison, here am I'm not going to talk to people I want to talk to. Am I in another big cell? That would be his language. And it will then force you to devise alternative ways of managing, particularly crowd control issues. We've learned at the time the advantage was, if you look at my height and his height, you would pray that, look, whatever that happens, you can take one for him. But in a situation where we are in an open place.
But how much of it was perhaps you, as his bodyguards, being in awe of the man? In fact, wasn't he, I mean, he appears to be a soft person, generally speaking. In other words, but how much of it was your own awe of the man that made you perhaps not want to offend him?
Well, there was a part of that. Because there's one thing about him. He's a very thorough person. He plans. But the plans is about him and what he wants to do. His attitude was that, look, I'm not going to stand in your way. Do your work. I'll do mine. Don't get into my way. So over time, we learned on how to do this. And that's when we realized that, amongst other things, Comrade Nelson Mandela liked beautiful people, women in particular.
That's
so
interesting.
One way of managing things was to ensure that there's somebody he likes, particularly...
Then it becomes softer.
Becomes softer.
And more amenable.
Then we have it our way.
Now, give us your worst day in the 4 years that you spent with him.
Well, the worst day, they're numerous, but there's one that really stands out. He needed to meet with Comrade Walter Sisulu. As you know, they both lived in Orlando West. And it was around 5, 6, and people were coming back from work. And he had this idea that it could be a nice walk to move from Vilakazi Street to Walter Sisulu's house. On that day, literally, we had to lock the gate and say to him, it's either our way or no way. Get into the car or else there's no meeting. And that's one battle, and I think that's one point where we're able to put our foot down to say there's no way Nelson Mandela is going to walk in the streets of Soweto with 4 of us around. What was going to happen?
And what did he say?
Well, he laughed it off and he thought we were joking. But I think there was a pressing matter. He had to go and see Comrade Walter Sisulu.
So he obliged eventually, got into the car.
Got into the car. And for me, what I found fascinating was the regard he held Walter Sisulu in. Because there was no alternative of saying you could talk to Comrade Walter to say, you rather come this way. He wouldn't allow that. And that would be easier to talk to Walter Sisulu to say, here's the situation. He'll come to our aid. But he wouldn't allow that. To him, that would be a greater sign of disrespect to Walter.
Any, perhaps, secrets that you were privy to during the course of that, during those 4 years?
I wouldn't really say it's secrets, but if there's any lesson, was that there was really no distance between Nelson Mandela in private and Nelson Mandela in public. The man you saw, his values, what he stood for, was what he was under all circumstances. And for me, it's something that I'll take to my grave, because I'm still to see an individual who's like that, who's really unpretentious.
In other words, he never put up a facade.
There's no facade with him. And of course, the worst thing on planning. I mean, there would be a string of people who'd want to see him, others claiming 10 minutes, 5 minutes. You know what would happen. The first 5 minutes is taken by him. He wants to greet you, check your health, inquire about your health, your kids, and by the time you know it, the time is gone. And there's somebody else who wants to see him. So we learned
But for someone who was punctual, because, I mean, a lot of people say he was very punctual, he was very strict about time and so on. So how did he manage that? Because he was, as you say, spending a lot of time not on what he's supposed to be talking about, and yet still have the time to actually honor all his appointments.
Absolutely. I mean, he was extremely disciplined. He kept time, was never late for any meeting. I mean, one embarrassing moment that I experienced, there was going to be a meeting with the Provincial Executive Committee of the ANC at Bramfontein Recreation Center. As usual, we took him there, and it turned out that the leadership was going to arrive late. And we were trying to buy time, checking if we could get him newspapers, just to keep him in the car and away from the venue, up until, everybody's there and there's a reception party. We won't have it that way. He said the meeting was set for 8. We're moving into the venue. We phoned people, Comrade Tokyo at the time, to say the president is here. He was saying, no, try and delay. There was no delay with Comrade Nelson Mandela. Went straight into the hall, straight into the stage, and no one was there. So you can imagine what happened when the rest of the leadership came in and Mandela was already sitting on stage. When he started speaking, he apologized for arriving at the meeting before others arrived. It was the most embarrassing moment I've ever seen. People could not look at him, and for the first time they understood what this idea of discipline was about. And to him it was not about himself. That's the attitude he always had about people, that if you respect people, you don't keep them waiting.
Wow. What do you think those of us who never got as close as you did don't know about him still?
I think that Mandela is very much an open book. His commitment, his love for his people, particularly the vulnerable, the underdogs, and his simplicity and just sheer humanity. I mean, up until now, we were just sharing some of the stories amongst ourselves on things, about him. Firstly, when we went to Victor Verster, he was so grateful. He thought that they've given him a TV in a kitchen, which turned out to be a microwave. And the man was battling for some time to get this TV to work until it had to be explained to him that, no, this thing is a microwave. Secondly, he had no sense of money, the value of money, I guess if you were to be taken away for 27 years, you wouldn't know what 2 rands can get you. But with him, he can give you a very long list of things to get for him and avail about 5 rands, So all of those things were things that made us think that here's this person, who could basically have everything that you want. And yet has never set his mind around things like money. And wealth. The last one was this sense of dress. At some point, Comrade Zwelakhe Sisulu, and may his soul rest in peace, bought his father a linen suit. And Comrade Walter was looking almost up to date now, with the linen suit. And Comrade Mandela pulled us aside and was saying he's getting worried. We're saying, but what's the story? He's saying, are things well at Walter's home? We're saying, what do you mean? We're saying, but his suits don't seem to be properly ironed. Now, you'd remember the linen was called Mashwabana. It's like that. But that was the kind of the person you were dealing with. I think there were more important things in his life than basic things like, fashion trends and things like that. And then, of course, when it came to food, one thing that we learned, no matter how sophisticated the event was to be, is for us to brief the people that, look, if you want him to enjoy the meal, keep it simple and keep it homely. Simple samp, simple beans, chicken and things like that. Don't go fancy with him, otherwise you won't eat your food.
What did you miss about working with him after 1994 when you could no longer do that?
Well, there was a transition. Remember, eventually the ANC infrastructure came back. The people who were in charge of security came back and took over from us. For me, it was quite a relief, quite frankly, because even today, I really salute those young men and women who continue to look after our leaders. It's a thankless job. You don't have your time. In fact, the sad part is it's you who goes to prison when you look after them, because you can't plan your life. Your life is planned around their lives, and that their lives are dependent on your life. But how can you keep your life intact when you're not in control? You can't say to your family, I'm back at 5, I'll see my kids at 8, because there's no such a thing. So it's a thankless job, and I really salute people to this very day who continue to do this work.
Hlongwa, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us.
It's a pleasure.
And may his soul rest in peace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, ANC whip in the Gauteng legislature, Brian Hlongwa, sharing with us some of those encounters with Madiba. Madiba loved beautiful people, women in particular. Now, Tokyo Sekhwale was a fellow prisoner and currently serves on the boards of Madiba's legacy foundations. He also shared some of his moments. What for you would be